They said the 76mm Sherman couldn't kill Panthers until HVAP rounds proved them wrong. Belgium, December 19, 1944. The forest was still dark when the first sound of wind moved through the frozen fir trees. Snow covered the ground in uneven layers, packed hard by recent storms and the movements of retreating American infantry. On a narrow ridge overlooking a valley road, Staff Sergeant David Cole Sherman sat hidden beneath netting and branches, its engine cold, its crew waiting in the dim interior for orders that could come at any moment. Inside the tank, it was cramped, quiet, and cold enough that breath drifted visibly in the low light. David sat with his back against the turret wall, a map unfolded across his lap. He was 24 years old, lean-faced, with deep lines across his features earned from nearly 2 years of tank combat. He had joined 3rd Armored Division in North Africa as a replacement driver, moved into the loader's position by Sicily, and finally became a commander after Normandy, when losses opened more positions than the Army could fill. His experience made him calm, deliberate, and aware of what a Panther could do to a Sherman. Across from him, the gunner Corporal Frank Russo adjusted the telescopic sight for the 3rd time in 10 minutes. He was 27, a former machinist from Pennsylvania, known for never rushing any mechanical adjustment. His hands were dry and cracked from the cold, but he kept working on the sight as if each millimeter mattered. In his mind, it did. If the Germans came down the road below, he would have seconds to find a target, aim, and fire. Private Tom Hardy, the loader, crouched near the ammunition racks, checking shell casings by touch. He had been in the crew only 4 months, arriving just before the Siegfried Line battles. He handled each round carefully, AP, smoke, turning them to make sure the fuses were clean, the driving bands intact, and the casings free of dents. It was his ritual before every engagement. It kept him focused and helped him control the nervous energy that built in the turret whenever the enemy was close. In the hull, Sergeant Leo Martinez sat in the driver's seat, hands resting lightly on the frozen steel control levers. A veteran of Normandy's hedgerows, he had learned to move the Sherman with precision even on mud, ice, or tree roots. The crew trusted him to keep them alive when shells began landing around them. To his right, Gunner Private Walter Red Jennings worked the feed tray on the .30 cal machine gun, clearing frost from the ammunition belt links. Red was restless, quick-tempered, and hated waiting more than combat itself. The platoon had been ordered to hold this ridge because it controlled the only reliable road through this sector of the Ardennes forest. American infantry units were falling back toward the west, disorganized by the sudden German offensive. The tanks were to delay any armored force long enough for those troops to regroup and form a defensive line. Their tasks were direct: observe German movement, engage if possible, prevent Panthers from pushing through. They were not expected to survive a prolonged engagement. They were expected to slow the enemy. The intercom buzzed with static, then a voice from platoon command broke through. The message was short. Panthers were confirmed in the woods to the east. Engines heard, tracks moving on frozen ground. Estimate: a platoon or more. The tanks on the ridge were to remain concealed, engines off, guns ready. Engagement authorized only if German armor attempted to break through the valley. David folded the map and slid it into the storage pouch. He rose to the commander's position and opened the hatch slightly, letting in a blast of freezing air. He looked across the valley. Fog drifted slowly over the snow, limiting visibility to a few hundred yards. Nothing moved, but the forest carried a tension that experienced soldiers recognized immediately. Frank spoke without lifting his eye from the sight. If they come straight at us, the 70th XS not going through their upper plate. You know that. David scanned the valley again before answering. We aim for the turret front or the sides if they angle. Anything but the glacis. Tom paused over an ammunition rack. They said the tests in England couldn't get through even at close range. They couldn't, David answered. Not with regular AP. Red muttered under his breath. So we're supposed to stop Panthers with what amounts to warning shots. No one corrected him. No one could. The Sherman's 76mm gun had been introduced with high hopes, But every crew on the Western Front had already learned the truth. From the front, against the Panthers' sloped armor, the gun was largely ineffective. It could kill the German tank, but not on equal terms. It required ambush positions, flank shots, or extreme luck. Martinez leaned forward in the driver's seat. Engines coming from the east. That's not trucks. The sound was faint at first. Low, steady vibrations traveling through the frozen ground. Tank engines idling, changing gears, pushing slowly through the forest. David lowered himself inside and closed the hatch. He adjusted the throat mic. Everyone ready. They're moving. Frank steadied his breathing, one hand on the elevation wheel, the other adjusting focus through the optics. Tom reached for the ready rack, hand hovering near the first AP shell. Red lifted the belt-fed machine gun and checked as firing arc Martinez braced his feet on the pedals. For a moment, the forest fell silent again. The fog thickened, swallowing the tree line. The cold air inside the tank sharpened the smell of oil and steel. Each man listened to the rhythm of the approaching engines, the pattern of weight shifting in snow, the unmistakable sound of an armored column preparing to break through. They all knew the belief shared by nearly every American tanker who had fought since Normandy. A Sherman could not kill a Panther head-on, not with the standard ammunition they carried, not at normal combat ranges. Yet their orders were clear. They had to hold this ridge for as long as possible. They had to delay the armor pushing toward the Meuse. They had to buy time. The engines grew louder. The ground trembled slightly beneath the tank. David lowered his head, adjusted the binoculars, and fixed his eyes on the fog-cloaked valley below. Whatever happened next would test everything they believed about their tank, their gun, and their chances of surviving the day. The first light of morning had not yet reached the valley when a distant engine noise faded behind the ridge, followed by the grinding of chains on packed snow. A 2.5-ton supply truck appeared on the western road, its headlights covered by blackout shields, engines struggling against frozen inclines. The vehicle approached the American line slowly, weaving between abandoned foxholes and damaged equipment left behind during the night's withdrawal. David's crew watched it through their periscopes, unsure why a supply truck would come this far forward when Panthers were confirmed nearby. The truck stopped beside the platoon sergeant Sherman. 2 ordnance officers climbed down, both shivering, both wearing heavy tanker jackets stained with motor oil. One carried a clipboard protectively under his arm. The other held a small iron crowbar and a metal flashlight with half-dead batteries. Without speaking, they moved to the truck's rear and pulled away a tarp stiff with frost. Underneath lay several wooden crates stamped with large black letters. AP, M93, HVAP, 76 millimeters. David opened his hatch halfway, keeping his head low. He had heard the designation only once before, months earlier on the far side of Normandy. Crews spoke of it like a rumor, an experimental round, lighter than standard AP, fitted with a tungsten carbide core meant to travel at extremely high velocity. Most tankers had never seen one. Some doubted they even existed outside of test facilities. The ordnance officer with the crowbar climbed into the truck bed. With a sharp crack, he pried open the lid of the nearest crate. Inside were rows of silver-gray shells, each cradled in fitted wooden slots. The projectiles looked strange, narrower, more pointed, with a hardened alloy penetrator inside the casing. One officer turned to the platoon sergeant and spoke calmly, though his breath fogged heavily as he talked. Hypervelocity, armor-piercing. Tungsten core. They weren't supposed to come up this route, but supply routed them wrong. Since your division is holding this ridge, higher command says issue them here rather than send them back. Frank, still inside the turret, muttered to the others, so supply made a mistake. For once a good one. Tom leaned closer to the open hatch, fascinated by the unusual rounds. These are lighter, right? They look almost like practice shells. The officer heard him. 15 pounds. That's why they move so fast. Almost 3,400 feet per second. They'll go through the side of a Panther clean if you hit square. Red's voice carried up from the hull. What about the front? The officer paused. He didn't look confident. Maybe. Depends on angle. Depends on range. Depends on how clean the shot is. Theory says it can do it under the right conditions. David knew what that meant in frontline terms. Nobody is certain. Theory didn't control weather, terrain, or nerves. Theory didn't sit inside a Sherman while a Panthers 75mm gun searched for a target. But the possibility, even without proof, was something the crew had not felt in months. The platoon sergeant inspected the crate, then spoke loud enough for all to hear. Each tank gets 6. Handle them carefully. Command wants them reserved for German heavy armor only. No exceptions. Tom took the first 2 shells, passed down into the turret. He held one upright, feeling how noticeably lighter it was compared to the standard AP he had been loading since Normandy. He rotated it slowly, checking the rotating band, the primer, the chamber fit. The round felt almost delicate for something meant to punch through hardened armor. Frank watched closely. Those things leave the barrel almost 1,000 feet per second faster than AP. Keep your shoulder clear when they fire. Recoil sharper. Martinez called up from below. That's if we even get to fire one. David answered, we will. If those Panthers come up this road, we won't have a choice. The ordnance officers finished unloading. Frost clung to their jackets as they worked. Before leaving, the one with the clipboard handed a sealed envelope to the platoon sergeant. Instructions, ballistic tables, recommended ranges. But truth is, you'll figure out faster than anyone at headquarters. Then the truck pulled away, its engine sputtering as it turned down the western route, disappearing behind the tree line. Inside the Sherman, the crew stared at the 6 HVAP shells now secured in the ready racks. They were unlike anything they had carried before. Rumors in the division claimed some tank destroyer crews had used HVAP with surprising results, but no detailed reports ever reached regular armor battalions. Too few rounds existed. Too much tungsten was needed elsewhere, for artillery tools, manufacturing dyes, aircraft parts. The Army simply couldn't produce enough. For David's crew to get 6 of them felt almost unreal. Tom broke the silence first. If these things work, if they actually do what they're supposed to, that changes everything. Frank didn't look away from the gun sight. Doesn't change the fact we only have 6. Red closed the ammunition bin with a metallic thump. 6 more chances than we had yesterday. David climbed back in his seat, closed the hatch, and took a long breath. He placed a gloved hand on the turret wall, feeling the cold steel vibrate faintly with every movement outside. The winter air filtered into the tank through seams and joints, chilling everything except the faint warmth from the ration heater. He looked at his crew, tired men with faces marked by frost, sleeplessness, and months of fighting. They knew what was coming. They knew why they were on this ridge. They were not expected to win a decisive battle. They were expected to slow a force that believed itself unstoppable. The HVAP rounds didn't erase the danger. They didn't guarantee survival. But they offered a possibility the crew hadn't had before, one that shifted the balance even slightly back toward them. David adjusted his microphone, eyes scanning the tree line through the narrow vision slit. Stay sharp. If Panthers are moving this way, we're going to need every advantage we have. The fog thickened again over the valley. Snow continued falling in thin, steady flakes that dissolved against the Sherman's armor. Somewhere beyond the forest's edge, the low thrum of German engines continued to build, growing louder with every minute. The men inside the tank checked their weapons one more time. The HVAP rounds rested in the turret bin, 6 silver-gray cylinders that could decide life or death for the crew before the day ended. The fog that had covered the valley began to thin as morning approached, revealing the outlines of snow-coated trees stretching across the lower ground. The air was still, and the only movement came from drifting flakes falling through the quiet forest. Inside the Sherman, David's crew remained tense and alert. The radio stayed on low volume, picking up faint transmissions from companies farther north reporting heavy German armor. Nothing moved in their sector yet, but every man felt the pressure building. Martinez, still leaning forward over the driver's controls, lifted his head. Contact left side. Something's moving behind the trees. David slid up in the commander's seat and opened the hatch just enough to raise his binoculars. The temperature inside and outside the tank felt almost the same. Frost gathered on the tips of the optics as he scanned the clearing. At first, he saw nothing but the dark outlines of pines and the pale floor of snow. Then a slight shift, a branch bending unnaturally, snow dislodging in a slow cascade. Frank, glued to his sight, spoke quietly. "That's not wind." Another minute passed. Then the first shape emerged. A tall, angular silhouette cut through the tree line, snow shedding from its hull as it moved. Its long 75 mm gun pointed straight ahead, barrel steady, turret rotating slightly as if searching for targets. The shape grew larger as it cleared the forest. A panther. Behind it, the snow vibrated as three more followed in staggered formation. Their engines rumbled, echoing through the valley like distant thunder muffled by the thick forest. The tanks were advancing slowly, maintaining discipline, maintaining spacing, their commanders likely confident in the strength of their forward armor. David lowered the binoculars. Panthers. 4 of them. Straight on. Frank's eye stayed fixed on the lead tank. Range about 1,100 yards. Moving at a walking pace. Red shifted uneasily in the hull. They're not even trying to hide. They think we can't touch them. David didn't answer. He watched as the first Panther reached a small curve in the road. Snow crunched under its tracks, leaving a clean rectangular pattern behind. German infantry followed along the ditches, rifles slung, occasionally glancing upward toward the American ridge. Tom reached for the ready rack. "AP, or he?" "AP," David said. "No point wasting he on them." Frank made minor adjustments to elevation and wind drift, then steadied the crosshairs. "I'll take the first shot once they clear the bend. That's the straightest line we'll get." The ridge provided elevation, but little concealment once the tank fired. Every round would reveal their exact position. David knew this. He also knew they had no choice. If the Panthers reached the valley floor undisturbed, they could sweep past the American infantry and roll straight toward the Meuse. The platoon's leftmost Sherman fired first. The sound cracked across the ridge, echoing through the trees. David watched the round hit the sloped upper plate of the lead Panther. The shell shattered on impact, scattering sparks and fragments across the snow. The Panther did not slow. It did not turn. It simply continued forward as if nothing had struck it. Frank muttered, "Same story as always." The second Panther swung its turret toward the flash of the American gun. Its muzzle blast lit the fog for an instant. A high-velocity shell slammed into the base of a pine tree near the U.S. tank. The trunk split apart, scattering with splinters across the snow. David felt the impact through the ridge. "Driver hold. Gunner, prepare to fire." Frank aligned the reticle on the front of the first Panther. "On target." Tom stood ready with the next round cradled in his arms. The lead Panther cleared the bend fully now, offering a clean frontal profile. Its glassy plate angled sharply, the gun glowing faintly from the cold air meeting heated steel. The commander's cupola opened briefly, revealing a German officer scanning the ridge with binoculars before ducking back inside. Frank steadied his breathing. AP loaded. Firing. The recoil pushed the turret back a few inches. The shell streaked across the valley and struck the Panther's mantlet with a metallic crack, leaving only a bright mark on the armor. The German tank swiveled its turret immediately toward David's position. Martinez shouted, "Incoming!" David ducked instinctively. A moment later, a Panther round exploded in the snow just short of their hull, throwing frozen earth and ice against the Sherman's armor. The tank shook, but nothing penetrated. David gripped the turret ring handhold. "Back us 2 yards. Keep the gun on him." Martinez reversed slowly, careful not to expose the tank to a different angle. The Sherman shifted behind a mound of snow, gaining a few feet of elevation while maintaining a firing position. Another round from a Panther slammed into the ridge to their right, carving a trench through the snow. The Germans were adjusting quickly, firing rapidly and at multiple targets. Frank exhaled hard. "We're not stopping them like this. These shots are just bouncing." Tom kept his hands near the HVAP compartment, but did not move without orders. Red pressed closer to his gun mount. If they keep coming, they'll walk right over us. David could see the reality forming as clearly as the tanks below. For Panthers advancing, shrugging off incoming fire, closing distance with every second. His crew was firing what they could, but the standard AP shells weren't making any impression on the German armor. He looked toward the ammunition bin containing the HVAP rounds. 6 shots. 6 chances. Frank spoke again, without emotion, without pressure, simply stating the truth. We have a new stuff. We either use it, or we won't get another opportunity. Tom's fingers tightened on the edge of the rack. His eyes shifted to David, waiting. David didn't decide immediately. He watched the Panthers moving in disciplined formation, infantry taking cover behind their tracks, the Germans confident and steady. Another Panther fired. The shockwave hit the Sherman's hull hard enough to vibrate through the crew's boots. David nodded once. Prepare to load HVAP. The atmosphere inside the tank shifted instantly. Every man felt it. Tom opened the bin and reached for the first silver-gray projectile. It was light, almost too light for a shell meant to pierce armor. He locked it into his arms and waited for Frank to call the moment. Outside, the Panthers pressed closer, their engines louder, their shots more accurate. The belief that the Sherman could not stop them was alive and strong on both sides of the valley. But inside the turret of David Cole's tank, that belief was about to be tested for the first time. Tom slid the lightweight HVAP round into the loader's cradle and held it steady, waiting for the breech to open. The Sherman shook again as another German shell impacted somewhere behind them, scattering snow over the rear deck. The tank's interior vibrated, dust and frost falling from weld seams. The crew stayed focused, eyes on their stations, movements controlled and practiced for months of combat. Frank kept his face close to the sight, his breathing steady. The lead Panther was 900 yards out now, angled only slightly off-center, still presenting nearly a full frontal profile. German infantry followed behind it in a loose formation, some using the tank's rear hull as partial cover. The Panther commander's cupola remained shut. He knew the ridge ahead held American armor, and he expected resistance. Breech open, Frank said. Tom pushed the HVAP round forward. It slid smoothly into the chamber, lighter than any AP round he had loaded before. The breech snapped shut with a metallic clack that echoed inside the turret. HVAP up, Tom reported. David gripped the turret rail. He knew they had only a handful of these rounds. Each one had a count. Gunner, you're clear to fire when ready. Frank rotated the turret a fraction to the left, fine-tuned elevation, and centered the reticle just below the Panther's gun mantlet. His voice stayed calm. Range 900. Target on. David watched the distant movement through his vision slit, the Panther growing larger as it advanced. The fog had lifted fully now, giving both sides an unobstructed view. The German tank continued forward with complete confidence, its driver trusting the armor that had deflected so many American rounds since Normandy. On the way, Frank said. The gun fired with a sharper, harder crack than usual. The recoil kicked through the turret, pushing the interior backward before the compensators settled the gun back into position. Smoke drifted around the barrel, blown quickly sideways by the cold wind. David immediately looked toward the Panther. The shell struck just left of center on the glassy plate. Instead of bouncing or fragmenting, it sent a small burst of light through the armor, followed by a deeper, irregular glow from inside the hull. A thin column of dark smoke rose from beneath the turret as the tank slowed, then rolled to a stop. Frank stared through the sight. Penetration confirmed. For a moment, the Panther didn't move. Then the driver's hatch flew open. A German crewman crawled out, dropping into the snow with flames on his jacket. Another climbed out from the loader's hatch, coughing and waving smoke away. The tank's engine idled weakly, then died completely. Inside the Sherman, no one spoke at first. Tom let out a small breath he'd been holding. It went through. Red muttered from below, disbelief plain in his voice. A Sherman just killed a Panther from the front. David didn't respond. He watched the burning Panther carefully, making sure it was out of action before turning his attention back to the others. The German formation had halted. The second Panther's turret rotated left and right, searching for the source of the shot. The third Panther angled slightly, unsure whether they were facing a new type of American gun or a concealed tank destroyer. Their advance had stopped, their confidence visibly shaken. Frank was already preparing for a follow-up shot, adjusting the sight to track the next Panther. Load another HVAP when ready. Tom reached for the second tungsten core round. He handled it with more purpose now. He had seen what it could do. He positioned the round for loading, waiting for the breech to open again. A German shell tore through the air overhead, exploding behind the ridge. Snow shot into the sky in a wide plume. The shockwave rattled the Sherman's suspension. Martinez called up from the driver's seat. "They're locking onto our position now." David nodded. "Hold steady. We fire again before they correct their aim." Frank tracked the second Panther, now presenting its turret front as it searched for targets. He adjusted elevation and windage, calculating the distance. Range 875. Target is turning toward us. Tom steadied himself, ready to load. Before Frank could fire, another Panther round detonated just short of their bow, showering the tank with ice and dirt. Red shielded his face as debris bounced off the machine gun mount. David tightened his grip on the turret rail. "Stay on him, Frank." Frank didn't look away. "I've got him." The Sherman's turret hummed softly as he made the last corrections. The German tank was turning its turret directly toward the ridge, trying to acquire them. Each second mattered. The breach opened. Tom slammed the second HVAP round home. "Up," he shouted. Frank squeezed the trigger. "On the way." The shot cracked through the cold air, disappearing in a blink. A moment later, the second Panther jerked violently as the round hit the upper curve of the turret front. A spray of armor fragments burst from the opposite side. Smoke began seeping from the commander's cupola. The tank shuddered, halted, then sagged slightly as the engine lost power. One of the German crew members opened the loader's hatch, stumbled onto the hull, and crawled through the snow, coughing hard. David watched carefully. Second one down. Good shooting. The two remaining Panthers hesitated. Their advance had collapsed. Infantry around them paused, unsure whether to continue forward or pull back. Officers shouted in German, waving their arms, signaling the tanks to reposition. Frank kept scanning. They're reassessing. They don't know what hit them. Tom kept his hand close to the remaining HVAP rounds, eyes fixed on David. "We've got 4 left." David nodded slowly. "Then we make these 4 count." The fog had lifted. The ridge was fully exposed. The Germans now knew exactly where the American fire was coming from. The next exchange would be faster, more violent, and far less forgiving. But the crew of David Cole Sherman had just proven something no one on that ridge believed possible a few minutes earlier. The Panther's armor could be broken, and now the battle was shifting in a way none of the German tank crews expected. The destruction of the first 2 Panthers created an immediate rupture in the German formation. For the past 6 months, Panther crews had advanced toward American positions with certainty built into their armor. They believed the upper glacis made them nearly immune to Sherman fire, and the turret front nearly as strong. That confidence vanished the moment 2 of their tanks fell within minutes. Both struck from the front. Both hid in places they had been told were safe. German infantry, walking in the ditches and scattered along the road, reacted first. Several dropped into the snow, unsure whether the unseen American weapon was artillery, a tank destroyer, or something else entirely. Squad leaders shouted in short, sharp commands, pulling their men back toward tree trunks, fallen logs, and shallow depressions along the road. The officers had not expected serious resistance this early. They were still trying to understand how their lead tanks had been knocked out so quickly. The remaining 2 Panthers halted immediately. Their engines growled as the drivers shifted into neutral, keeping the tanks angled slightly toward the ridge. Both turrets moved independently, searching for muzzle flashes and trying to locate the Sherman that had fired HVAP. White exhaust drifted behind the tanks in thin plumes, barely visible in the cold air. Inside David Sherman, The crew used those brief moments to breathe. Powder smoke still hung in the turret. The metal floor vibrated faintly from the earlier recoil. Tom wiped sweat from his forehead despite the freezing temperature and reached for the next HVAP round, but he didn't remove it from the rack. He waited for the next order. Frank remained at the site, I glued to the reticle, tracking turret movement from the nearest mobile Panther. The second one's turret is turning this way. They're narrowing it down. Red in the hull cleared the frozen dirt and ice from his machine gun slot. They're confused. They don't know what we're shooting, but they're going to figure it out quick. Martinez kept the engine off, hands resting on the levers, ready to move at the first sign of an incoming round. We don't want to be here when they correct their fire. David studied the battlefield through his slit. The two remaining Panthers were about 900 yards out. One was angling slightly left, attempting to widen its field of fire. The other remained stationary, using its optics to scan the ridge. German infantry gathered in small clusters, looking up nervously at the ridge, pointing, then relocating behind whatever cover they could find. "Damn," Frank said quietly. "They're not falling back yet. They're figuring out whether to push or pull." A sudden flash erupted from the Panther on the left. A shell tore across the valley and impacted halfway up the ridge, blasting apart a sheet of ice and dirt. The explosion rattled the Sherman violently. The crew instinctively ducked. "Driver, rotate right 2 yards," David ordered. Martinez backed the tank slightly, keeping the hull angled but remaining within firing position. Snow compressed under the tracks as the Sherman shifted. The Panther fired again, this time closer. Snow showered over the tank, landing across the turret roof and hatch covers. Red shook loose the debris that had fallen through the gun port. Frank raised his voice slightly. "Gunner ready. If they expose their sides, we can take the shot." Before David could answer, the platoon net crackled. A distant Sherman commander shouted over the radio. "Panthers halting. One turret on fire. German infantry pulling back from forward line." David leaned into his microphone. "Copy. We see 2 still active in front of us." Another Panther gun fired. This time it struck a mound of snow 20 yards to their left, throwing a heavy wave of ice across the ridge. The second Panther adjusted quickly, preparing to fire on the same spot. The Germans were now bracketing their position. Frank exhaled slowly. "They're getting closer on the corrections. One more shot, and they'll have us dialed in." David scanned again. The Panther on the right was shifting to a new position, pivoting its hull to angle for a flanking view. The move was slow but deliberate. German armor doctrine trained crews to use the Panther's mobility to outmaneuver American tanks whenever possible. If they gained the right angle, their 75mm gun could kill a Sherman with a single hit. "Driver, hold," David said quietly. "Gunner, adjust to the right Panther." Frank swung the sight a few degrees. "On him." Tom's hand hovered near the HVAP rack. "Say the word." But before David could give the order, something unexpected happened. The German infantry began pulling back farther up the road, using the ditches for cover. Officers were waving them rearward, directing them to reposition behind the third damaged tank. Red noticed it first. "They're not pushing. They're backing up." Frank confirmed it through the sight. The Panthers, too. "They're not advancing. They're reassessing." The Panther on the right stopped its pivot. The turret paused for several seconds, then rotated back toward the valley. The driver reversed a few yards, keeping the hull angled toward the ridge. "They think we have tank destroyers," Martinez said. David agreed. The sudden frontal kills had changed the Germans' assumptions. The Panther was designed with the expectation that it could absorb frontal fire from American tanks. When that belief collapsed, caution replaced confidence. Another Panther round fired, but it wasn't aimed at the Sherman. It was a suppressive shot meant to discourage U.S. infantry movement further down the valley. A moment later, the engine of the right side Panther revved loudly as it reversed farther toward the tree line. Frank followed it with the scope. "They're pulling out. They're not risking another direct approach." Tom let out a tense breath. "They're scared of what we're firing." David didn't smile. He knew better than to believe the threat was over. "They're cautious, not scared. They'll regroup." They'll come again. The left Panther continued to back away, smoke from the two destroyed tanks drifting around it. German infantry retreated in small units, some carrying wounded, others dragging equipment through the snow. The valley remained filled with engine noise, but the forward momentum had stopped completely. For the moment, the ridge was quiet again. The crew inside the Sherman sat still, listening to the fading engines. Powder smoke hung in the turret. The air was cold and thick. The HVAP rounds in the bin gleamed faintly under the dim turret light. Tom finally asked, "How many HVAP do we have left?" "4," David answered, "and we'll need all of them before this is over." The enemy had been forced to reconsider the weak point in their attack. They had pulled back but not broken. When they returned, they would be more methodical, more coordinated, and far more cautious about exposing themselves. The first shock was over. The next phase would be even harder. The valley stayed quiet for nearly 20 minutes after the Panthers withdrew into the fog-shrouded trees. No firing came from the German side, only scattered infantry movement and the low hum of engines repositioning out of sight. David used the brake to check their situation. The crew was shaken but alert. The Sherman's armor had taken no direct hits, though a few impacts had sent fragments across the hull. The gun was functioning, the optics clear, and the remaining HVAP rounds secured in the bin. They were still in the fight, but the crew knew the next engagement would be harder. The Germans now understood that something on the ridge was capable of penetrating Panther armor. Frank remained at the site even during the lull, observing movement in the tree line. They're regrouping. They're not leaving. They're shifting for a new attack route. Tom rechecked each shell in the ready rack. His movements were faster now, with more urgency, though he tried to keep his breathing steady. If they come at us again, they're not going to give us a clean frontal shot. They're going to try to angle and flank. Red in the hull had already repositioned the .30 cal, tightening the belt and clearing frost from the receiver. They're pissed off. They're going to come back with a plan this time. Martinez rested his hands on the driver's levers, leaning slightly forward, ready for immediate maneuver. We can't stay still if they start bracketing us. Once they get our range locked, we move or we die. David scanned the right side of the valley through the slit. Something about the forest seemed different. The fog was thicker in patches, stirred by engine exhaust. The light had sharpened, the sun rising just enough to cast faint illumination through the trees. Then he saw it, movement low and wide. "Contact, right flank," David said. Frank adjusted the turret before David finished speaking. Through the sight, he saw it clearly. A Panther emerging from deeper in the forest, using the slope and trees to mask most of its hull. It approached from a wider angle, attempting to gain a diagonal view of the ridge, an angle the Germans believed would expose a Sherman's weaker side armor. Tom moved immediately to the HVAP rack and held the next round ready. A second Panther appeared on the opposite side of the road, spaced far apart from the first. It kept distance from the destroyed tanks, turning its hull deliberately to maintain its strongest armor toward the ridge while keeping its options open for maneuver. "They're coming from both sides," Frank said, "left and right. They're trying to split our focus." David watched them with growing tension. They're going to test for weak spots. They want us to commit to one direction so the other can fire first. The first Panther on the right advanced slowly, staying partially concealed by trees, revealing only the upper portion of the turret and the long 75mm gun. Snow fell from branches as it pushed through them, the rumble of the engine muffled but unmistakable. Frank adjusted carefully. "How about the right side Panther? Range 850. Tom waited for the call. "Say it." But David looked left. "Hold that round. I want eyes on the left Panther first." The Panther on the left was performing a slow, deliberate pivot, trying to angle its thick glacis toward the ridge while presenting its turret front. Another strong point. Its commander wasn't rushing. He was studying the terrain, trying to estimate where the first two Panthers had been hit. "They're being too careful," Red said nervously. "They're thinking, not charging." Frank returned his view to the right. "The right side Panther is stopping. Turret's turning toward us." David made the decision quickly. "Right side first. Load HVP." The breach opened. Tom pushed the round in, the lightweight tungsten core sliding smoothly into place. The breech locked shut. Up, Tom said. Frank lowered his face to the sight. He's turning his turret straight toward us. He thinks he has a clean line. David gripped the turret handhold. Gunner, when clear. Frank steadied. He waited. He exhaled. On the way. The shot cracked sharply across the valley. The recoil hit the turret platform hard enough to shake loose small flakes of frost from the ceiling. David instantly searched for impact. The HVAP round struck the right side Panther on the turret front, slightly above the gun mantlet. A flash appeared, followed by a burst of armor fragments ejecting upward. Smoke spilled out from under the commander's cupola. Frank confirmed it immediately. Penetration. The Panther jerked to a stop. Its turret sagged, no longer moving. A hatch opened, and a German crewman stumbled out, dropping into the snow. Tom reached for the next HVAP round. 3 left. David scanned left. The remaining Panther had witnessed the kill. Instead of retreating, it increased speed, moving from the road to a more open position where it could bring its full gun arc to bear on the ridge. Frank turned the turret. Left Panther accelerating. He's going for a shot. The German tank cleared the last line of trees and immediately fired. The muzzle blast flared bright in the cold air. The shell whistled over the ridge, missing the Sherman by a margin of yards, exploding against a boulder behind them. The shockwave rattled the hull violently. Martinez shouted, "That one's close. They got us marked." Tom held the next round at chest height, waiting. His hand was steady now, focused. Frank dialed the sight onto the left Panther. Range 760. He's still moving. David watched carefully. Timing would decide everything. Wait for him to slow. Don't fire while he's turning. The Panther continued its advance, treads biting cleanly into the snow, turret rotating with precise, controlled movements. The German crew was disciplined, trained, and determined to neutralize the threat quickly. They no longer underestimated the ridge. The tank stopped for just one moment, long enough to recalculate range, adjust barrel elevation, and prepare for its next shot. Frank said, "Now." The breech opened. Tom slammed the HVP round into place. Up. On the way. The third HVAP round fired with the same sharp snap, disappearing into the cold air. A second later, it punched through the left Panther's side armor just behind the turret. A burst of dark smoke and internal sparks shot out from the exit point. The tank rocked slightly as its engine cut out. Its tracks stopped moving. The turret froze at mid-rotation. A German crewman opened the hatch, hesitated, then climbed out with hands raised to shield his face from the smoke. Inside the Sherman, the crew didn't celebrate. They stayed focused, breath steady. Tom counted under his breath. 2 HVAP left. David scanned the valley. No more tanks advanced. German infantry moved backward in scattered formations, unsure whether the Americans had more of the new ammunition. The ridge held firm. Frank kept his eye to the sight. No more armor moving. They're falling back. David nodded slowly, understanding the significance of what had just happened. The German attack had changed. Their certainty was gone. Their forward momentum was broken. The Panther, Germany's most feared tank, had just been stopped by a Sherman, not through luck, but through repeated, decisive penetrations. The crew remained silent for a long moment, processing the shift they had just witnessed. The myth of invulnerable Panther armor had been shattered across the valley floor. And the battle was not over yet. The gunfire faded slowly, leaving only the low echo of distant engines and the sound of wind pushing across the frozen ridge. The valley below was marked by dark forms half covered in smoke and drifting snow. 2 Panthers burned quietly, their exhaust ports glowing faint orange under the soot. A third sat motionless near the tree lean, its crew long gone. The last surviving Panther had withdrawn into the woods, its tracks cutting a clear path back toward the German rear. No German infantry remained in the open. They had pulled back in small groups, staying close to trees and ditches, leaving equipment scattered in the snow. Inside David's Sherman, the atmosphere was heavy but steady. Powder smoke clung to the turret interior, mixing with the smell of cold steel and burned propellant. Tom leaned back from the ammunition racks, arms resting on his knees, sweat and frost mixing on his helmet straps. He exhaled slowly, his breath visible in the freezing air. All HVAP rounds accounted. 2 left in the rack. For fired. Frank didn't move from the site. He continued scanning the valley, as if expecting another tank to appear. His voice was quieter now, but still controlled. No movement. No armor signatures. They're pulling out for real. Red rubbed his ears, still ringing from the last Panther shot that had passed too close. They didn't expect it. They didn't think a Sherman could break them open. Martinez remained ready at the controls, the engines still off, watching the slopes ahead. If they come back, it won't be anything like the first pass. They'll be cautious now. They'll think twice before showing their fronts. David slowly lifted himself through the commander's hatch. The cold air hit him immediately, sharper than before, filled with drifting smoke and the smell of burning rubber from the destroyed German armor. He scanned the valley through binoculars. German medics pulled 2 wounded infantrymen back behind the 3rd Panther, moving quickly under cover of smoke. Officers directed men farther up the road, forming a defensive line deep in the tree line. The assault had stopped completely. He lowered the binoculars. They're reorganizing, not preparing another push. They're done here. The platoon net crackled as another Sherman commander reported in. Enemy armor retreating east. 2 confirmed destroyed. 1 disabled. Infantry falling back. Ridge secure for now. A second voice followed. Hold positions until relief arrives. Expect counter-battery fire. Do not advance. David dropped back inside the tank. His crew looked at him, silent but waiting for direction. They're not coming again. Armor's gone. Infantry is pulling out. Tom nodded once, then looked at the remaining HVAP shells with a kind of disbelief. We could have used these months ago. Frank tapped the side of the site. Supply didn't have enough to send, and they didn't believe most crews needed it. Tank destroyers got priority. Red muttered, "We did their job today." Martinez let his hands fall from the levers. Doesn't matter who gets credit. All that matters is we held. David didn't respond. He knew his driver was right, but he also knew what this moment meant, not just for them, but for every crew along the front. The idea of the Panther as an unbeatable machine had shaped American tank tactics since Normandy. Crews avoided frontal duels whenever possible. They maneuvered, flanked, and improvised because the alternative was suicide. Now a single Sherman had killed 3 Panthers within 1 engagement, 2 of them with frontal shots the Germans hadn't believed possible. It would not change the balance of the war by itself. HVAP was too rare, and Panthers too numerous. But it would change something inside the men who fought these battles, their understanding of what was possible, and their belief in their own chances of surviving the next encounter. Minutes later, the sound of truck engines rumbled behind the ridge. An American medical jeep passed between trees, heading for the infantry positions below. Behind it came a half-track carrying ammunition and tools. A captain climbed down from the half-track, approached David's tank, and looked over the valley with a long, measured gaze. He turned toward David. "Did your crew fire the HVAP?" "We did." The captain nodded, eyeing the burning Panthers. "Effective." David answered plainly. "It worked." The captain looked at the destroyed tanks again before speaking. "Division command will want to know exactly what happened here. You may have been the first crew in this sector to make front plate penetrations." David didn't react outwardly. He kept his tone level. "We fired what we were issued. Nothing more." The captain didn't press the matter. He simply said, "Hold the ridge until relieved," then walked back to the half-track, boots crunching in the snow. As the vehicles pulled away, the valley fell quiet again, leaving only the steady hiss of burning fuel from the knocked-out Panthers. David returned to the turret, steadying himself before sitting. The crew waited for him to speak, and he finally did. "Check systems, then stand down. We're holding here." The men relaxed slightly, though not completely. This sector was still unstable, and the Germans were known to counterattack at unpredictable intervals. But for the moment, the ridge belonged to them. Tom leaned back against the turret wall, staring at the remaining HVAP rounds. "We still have two. Never thought I'd load even one." Frank closed his sight cover and rested his hands on his legs. "We'll keep them ready. Day's not over." Red shifted in his seat. "They won't forget this. Those crews will tell everyone what happened here." Martinez finally took a deeper breath. "Good. Let them know Sherman crews don't fold." David looked around the turret at each of them. Tired faces lit faintly by the dim bulbs overhead, sweat mixing with frost, harness straps stiff from the cold, hands still shaking slightly from the adrenaline of the fight. None of them spoke further. They didn't need to. They knew what they had done. They knew how close it had been. And they knew that, for one morning on a frozen ridge in Belgium, their tank, a machine that had been doubted by so many, had stood its ground against what was supposed to be an unbeatable enemy. The ridge remained quiet. Snow continued to fall, and the crew of David Cole's Sherman waited for the next order, with the understanding that the myth of Panther invincibility had ended right below them.